Okay, so what we're going to try to implement today is just an example of using Session with Rails, and we're going to use it in the context of this fake Twitter application. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what Session actually is before I get going. And so if we think back to sort of the early days of the web was built entirely on the HTTP protocol. And when the HTTP protocol was first developed, it was developed in a way such that it would be a stateless protocol, meaning that every time you visit a page on the internet, even if you've had previous encounters with the server that you're connecting to, like if you just clicked on a link on a page and you went to another page within the same server, as far as your web browser is concerned and the server is concerned, it's like you're visiting that page for the first time. There's no state maintained. If you think about a Rails controller, for example, if we look at our index controller here, when a user goes and makes a connection to our website, so in our case, they go to the root and they load up the index action of the tweets controller. After that action has executed and the view has been sent to the end user, all of the variables that have been created, this @tweets variable and this tweet variable, they all lose scope and the memory is reclaimed. All that memory goes away. If I then, for example, reload the index page, all of that has to be re-executed and all that state gets reloaded into memory. And then at the end of it, when it's sent to my browser, again, all that state disappears. The reason why HTTP was built without state is if you think about most programming that you've done, when you have a bug in your code, it's usually a bug that has to do with state. It's some variable that you have that's either not set, so it's nil, or it's set to something that you didn't expect or that your code didn't expect, and then your code has an error in it. And when building a giant sort of networking protocol that was supposed to sort of power a sort of global repository of knowledge like the World Wide Web, they did not want there to be the possibility of stateful errors. They didn't want there to be a chance that a web server could get into a bad state by way of an interaction with a particular user and then be broken. So imagine if you were on a website like Twitter and you put in some kind of incorrect information and suddenly you get Twitter, the entire thing, into a bad state and nobody could use it. So the idea behind HTTP was that it would be stateless, so there wasn't any possibility of maintaining state and potentially state bugs from web page invocation to web page invocation. The problem with a stateless protocol, though, is that you can't remember anything about your users from page to page. So if you have a page where you're asking your users to log in and they provide a username and a password, you can go to the database and you can check to see if that username and password exists in a database table, and you can let them do whatever they wanted to do on that particular invocation. The next time they click a link that needs authentication, you'd have to ask them again for their username and password because you will have not remembered that they had logged in before. And so quite early on in the days of web browsers, it was decided that there needed to be some way to maintain state that had to do with a particular user using your website. And so what was built into web browsers was this idea of a browser cookie. And what the browser cookie really just is, it's a way of setting some state where either JavaScript or a server-side programming language is able to save basically a key value pair, similar to a Ruby hash, on the user's browser. And so they leave it up to the browser to actually save the state. So again, the server itself doesn't know anything about the individual user until the user gives it some information back. And that's done behind the scenes by way of a web browser. So if you have a script, a server-side script that sets a browser cookie, you can then save some information by way of that browser cookie on a user's browser. And the next time the user visits your website, the browser itself sends all of the cookies that had been previously set by that particular domain. And so if you were visiting, in our case, localhost, and localhost had set a cookie on your web browser, the next time and the time after and the time after that you visit localhost, you will sort of resend the cookie information that you had been previously sent. And that happens behind the scenes. You don't actually get to see it happen, but it's a little clumsy and hard to work with. So eventually a lot of the backend server-side languages started to create something like what they call session. And there's a version of session in PHP, there's a version of session in Rails. Although I don't do a lot of ASP programming, I imagine there's a version of session in ASP.NET to do the same thing, to maintain state. And in Rails, we get a variable which looks like a regular session. It's called session, and it looks like a regular hash. So, for example, if I wanted in my index of my tweets controller here to remember how many times a particular user had loaded this page up. So imagine if I come to this page and at the top of the screen I might say, you have visited this page one time, and then the next time you come back you have visited this page 2 times, 3 times, etc. What I can do is I can save that information, the actual count, inside of a variable called session. And to me, in the back end, it looks like it's just a regular old variable. I can index at a position of my own creation. So I could say I want to call it visit count. And let's say to start with, we just explicitly set visit count to 1. It looks like this is happening on my server. But what's actually going to happen is, yes, I'm using a variable on my backend on my server, but unbeknownst to me, the server is sending a browser cookie to the user who is connected to this index page, and a visit count of 1 is being set inside of that browser cookie. And the next time that user visits my site again, the user's browser will send that data back to the server. So the server will know, okay, I see that you've been here before, and I can see that the last time you were here, your visit count was n, where n is the amount that had sort of been logged into it. So we need to do something a little bit more than, for example, this. You might think you could just do this, session at position visit count plus equals 1. And every time they visit this website, this number will go up by 1. Doesn't quite work because of the fact that the first time they visit this web page, the visit count at position, the session at position visit count will be nil. So we need a bit of a test. We can say if session at position visit count, if it's nil, well, then I'm going to create a variable called visit count. Then I'm going to create it as an instance variable because later on I'm going to want to make it accessible inside of my view. And I'll say, okay, so this means that they're visiting here for the very first time. So if this is true, visiting for the first time. And so if they're visiting for the first time, this visit count will be 1. Otherwise, the user has been here before, meaning that they have some kind of value already in their visit counter. And so what I can do then is I can set this visit count variable to be equal to what is stored currently right now in the visit count plus 1. So assuming that I previously put a number in there, get that number, retrieve it, and add 1 to it. And then after either of those paths occurred, I will now have the visit count stored in this visit count variable. I want to then put that back into the session. And this will trigger a cookie, a browser cookie being set. So again, the flow of logic happening here is this user visiting for the very first time? Do they have a visit count set in the session? If not, if it's nil, then set this visit count variable to 1. Otherwise, and I've spelled else wrong there, otherwise they've been here before, meaning this is not nil, so take the value that's currently in there, add 1 to it, and now we have the new visit count. They're here again, add 1 more. And then so that we can remember it for next time, we have to trigger this to be set as a cookie on the user's browser. And so we put this visit count back into session at position visit count. And again, we're just treating it like a regular old variable. But sort of behind the scenes, what's going to be happening is by way of HTTP headers, these cookies are going to be transferred back and forth between our browser. So before our view gets sent to the user, part of the HTTP headers that are going to be sent out as part of the view being rendered is going to be a browser cookie that includes the visit count and the actual count itself. When the user comes back to our website, we're going to retrieve that information because their browser will have, with their request, sent all cookies that belong to this particular domain. So let's try this out. To make it a little bit more visible, I'm going to also make use of this @VisitCount variable inside of my view. And so inside of my view above the form, I'm going to create, remember this is a Haml view, I'm going to create a paragraph tag inside of which I will say you have visited this page visit count times. Okay, I think that's all I need. Visit count's getting set here and persisted into session. The very first time this user visits, there will be nothing in the visit count, and so visit count should be set to 1, and then I will then stash it back into session. The next time they come back to this page, we will now have something in session, and so we will retrieve that number, which would be 1 at this point, add 1 to it, visit count will then be 2, and the number should just continually increase every time we visit this page. Let's try it out to see if I've done this all correctly. You visited this page 1 times. Rails has the cool sort of pluralize helper to fix those kind of pluralization issues. So I can say pluralize visit count, comma, time. I can get rid of times here. And now when visit count is 1, it'll leave it singularized. When visit count is more than 1, it'll pluralize it for us. Reload the page 2 times, reload the page 3 times, reload the page 4 times. If we do a Control-Shift-I to bring up the developer tools, we can actually look and we can see that there's a cookie. There's actually 2 cookies set here because of the fact that I was doing this with the other group this morning. So I'll delete the other group's cookie. This is the cookie content. It's a big long string of characters. I'm not exactly sure what Rails is doing, but the data is encoded somewhere in this value. So it's like somehow they've converted the key and value, the visit and then the actual visit count itself, they've encoded that somehow inside of this value, which is this big long string. If we were to actually look at the network when we make a page request here, so if I reload the page and I inspect, this is my initial request, this is my GET request to the root route. As part of that, I get to see the request headers. These are the HTTP headers that my browser has actually sent to the server on making a request. This is the kind of stuff we normally get to ignore when dealing with HTTP. The browser and the server do a whole little bit of like a miniature conversation before any page is even loaded, where the user's browser will specify to the server the different MIME types it knows how to read, whether or not it can take zipped data, the default language of the browser being used. And there you can see this right here. This is the cookie. This is the cookie that had been previously set by the server, and now my browser is sending it back to the server that had originally set it. This is important because it's not like once you get a cookie on your machine, it's just going to be sent out to every website on the internet. Cookies are only sent back to the domains that originally set them. So if you have a cookie that has been set by twitter.com, your browser will only send that cookie back to twitter.com. And otherwise, there would be some sort of privacy issues involved. Again, though, you can see here, these are the response headers. This is the server speaking back to our browser. And you can see one of the headers amongst a bunch of others, like the content type, the date. This e tag is used for caching purposes. There is a set cookie header being used. And encoded within this cookie somewhere will be the new visit count. Now, there are a couple different ways of dealing with session in Rails. By default, it encodes the data directly into the cookie. You can expose some of the limitations of that. If you start saving too much into session in Rails, you end up hitting the maximum length of a cookie, which is 4 kilobytes. And you can actually then configure Rails to, instead of encrypting the data and setting it inside of the cookie, it just sends a unique identifier. It's like you are user, and it gives them a unique identifier. And then the session data can actually be saved in a database on your server side. So the default is just to use the cookie itself. So every time we revisit this page, our number is going to increase. And every time we do so, it's because of the fact that when the browser made a request to the server, it sent a cookie along with that request that specified the visit count from the previous encounter. And then using that visit count from the previous encounter right here, the server will reset it with a number 1 larger than before by way of a set cookie header. So there's a lot sort of going on in the back end. As far as us as programmers, we just get this magical session hash that we treat like a local variable, except for the fact that there's a separate session hash for every single separate user who's visiting our website. And so if I pull up a different browser here, like Firefox, and I go to the same website, you can see here, one of the things you get to see is that I didn't build my CSS to be actually functional outside of Chrome. So the CSS doesn't actually work in Firefox here. But nonetheless, if we reload it, you can see the first time it says you've been here 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and that's completely independent from the count that's going on in Chrome. And if I pulled up Internet Explorer, you would see that it would have its own count that would be separate from the other 2 counts. So it would start at 1 and it would continue to increase independent of the others. And so in this case, because each separate browser has its own separate cookie store, they're taken to be separate users. So it's effectively, it's almost like you get a different version of the session hash for each user that comes to your website. And you don't have to manage any of that yourself. Rails just manages that for you behind the scenes. For testing purposes, you can always use, if you want a separate cookie store, you can always go to incognito mode in Chrome, and that gives you a separate cookie store. So here in incognito mode, I've gone back down to the number 1 for my count, 2, 3, etc. Meanwhile, over in the regular Chrome, I'm still climbing up above 10. But if I was to create a whole new tab inside of Chrome, a non-incognito mode tab, it's going to share the cookie with the other tab. And so if I open both of these in Windows beside each other, these are both Chrome tabs, not incognito tabs. And if I reload one, this one goes up to 15. I go back to the other, we should see 16. Go back to this one, we should see 17. Go back to this one, we should see 18. So the cookies do get shared across tabs within a particular browser, but they don't get shared across browsers themselves, different browsers. And so this is, it's almost like when we have different browsers, it's like we're simulated different users on different computers, different places of the internet. So that said, does anyone have any questions about just this initial sort of simple use of session? It's pretty straightforward. You can almost just treat it like it's a regular old variable, and you almost don't even need to worry so much about the complexity that's happening beyond the scenes. Let's imagine that we wanted this session, specifically this visit count, to work on other pages on our website. So we could imagine maybe I have an About Us page on this website. So I have another controller action called About, and along with that I have another app views tweets file, which is going to be called about.html.haml, and I'll open that up inside of my Komodo, and I'm going to create another route for it where I say a get to /about should load up the tweets about action, and let's say this is as About Us. So I've created another named route. It's named About Us, and this will trigger /about will trigger the about action of the tweets controller. Inside of this view here, I might create let's see what I've done over on this one. Maybe I'll create an H2 or an H1 that says About Us. I might have a paragraph. This is the content of the About Us page. And then I'm going to just copy and paste that same line from the previous index page, saying you have visited this page visit count times. If I try to load this up right now, it's going to cause an error. So if I try to go to /about, oh, that's interesting. 0, even though I'm not loading up that instance variable at all. But will it always be 0? Yes. Okay. Nonetheless, if I want to actually make it so that that number's going up, just like it is on the index page, so this page, how it's going up, I would need to include the same kind of code over here. What I don't want to have to do, but what I will initially do, is just copy and paste that code. So I can just initially repeat this code, and then to make navigation between the two views a little simpler, I will, on this view, build a link to the About Us page, which goes to the About Us path. Remember, the name of my route was About Us. And on the About page, I can bring a paragraph with a link to home going to the root path. So that'll get me back and forth. Now I'll have links to get me back and forth between About and the index. And now in the controller actions, both of the controller actions are doing the same thing. They're both testing to see if there is a cookie or a session key called visit count. And depending on if there is or not, they're going to set this visit count variable, and then both of them are going to save that visit count back to the session. So if I go now back to my website, 22 times on this page. If I click to the About Us page, it should say 23. And it does. Click back to home, it should say 24. Click back to About Us, it should say 25. If I stay on the About Us and reload it, it should just continually go up, 27, 28, 29. And then when I go back home here, it should go up to 30. So I've effectively got session working across both of these actions, but at the expense of a lot of repetition in my code. So one thing I can do is I could remove that repetition to a separate method. And I already have a protected section down below where I have this tweet params. And remember, that's the method that the create action is using to ensure that the params hash is properly set up such that we always require a tweet to be in the params hash and that we have access to the status. I can also create a method that says perhaps load visit count. And inside of that load visit count method, I could take this copy and pasted code and drop it in here. And I'll bump this back. And now I can remove that replicated code from both locations, and I can simply call load visit count in both locations. So that removes a bit of repetition, right? I've got my code down here. I've got it in a protected area because it's not going to be an action. I'm never going to route to this particular method. So I don't want it to be a public method within my controller, because the public methods within my controller, they're my actions. They're the things I route to. So I make it a protected method so it can only be called from within another action. And I call it load visit count. And here I am loading the visit count inside of the index, and here I am loading the visit count inside of the about. And it should still work. So if I reload this page, the number should go up to 31. If I go to about us, it should be at 32. Back over here, 33, 34. If I reload this page a couple times, seems to be working. That's all well and good, but again, there could be some repetition going on. Here, sure, I am only using it twice, so I've got this line in here twice. But imagine I continued to grow my website and I had, 10 different actions in here. Do I really want to be calling load visit count at the top of every single one of them? Probably not. Especially if maybe I want this visit count to be loaded up across multiple controllers. Maybe there's eventually hundreds of different actions. It would seem crazy to have this load visit count appear everywhere on my website. And this is where the before filters come into play. So I can go up here and I can say before action. So before any of these actions execute, we want Rails to run the load visit count. And now it will. So I can go back over here. When I'm on their boat husk, the visit count appears to be going up. Go back to home, 42. It continues to grow, all because of this. It will even increase when I submit a tweet. Whether or not that's really what I want, I'm not sure. Let's imagine that it isn't what I want, so that I want my count to go up for my index and my about, but not for the create action. Well, what I can do with the before action is I can list the actions that I want this system or this load visit count to be loaded on. So I can say before action, load visit count, but for only the index and the about page. And by specifying only and then an array of symbols, it'll know that load visit count should be executed before the index, before the about, but it won't execute it before the create. And there's an opposite of only. I could specify it also by saying except. And in this case, it's except create. So I don't even need an array. I can just see except create like that. And in this case, Rails will now run the load visit count action before all of our actions except for the create action. So it should still be working and doing what it needs to do. So reload this page. And then back over to about us, it's still working. If we wanted this to eventually sort of go beyond just one controller, we could expand out into our application controller. So remember that all controllers inherit from something called application controller. An application controller is in our app controllers folder. And we can add things to this application controller and then all controllers will inherit them. And so we could take this before action and we could put it over there. And we could take this method and we could put it in a protected section of the application controller. By making it protected, it's going to be inherited by the things that inherit from the application controller. If we made it private, it would not be inherited. So that's the big difference in Ruby between protected and private. If we had made this private method, it will not be inherited by the subclasses. When it's protected, it is inherited by the subclasses. So now what's going to happen is before any action of any controllers in our entire system, we're going to load the visit count, except if the action happens to be called create. So again, I can now sort of clean up this code, get my spacing sort of back in order here, and it should still work. So even though we're not mentioning it anywhere in the tweets controller for the index and the action, when I go to the website itself, I reload this page, 49, 50, 51. So it's going up. And now throughout our website, we could also use this @VisitCount variable, because we should know that it's always going to be present. Before any action other than create actions, this @VisitCount variable is always going to be brought into existence. So we can do things like on the home page, we might, for example, have some logic that says, if the visit count is greater than 60, then create a paragraph tag that says, congrats, you have visited this page many times. And I might use I know that I have styling for a paragraph of type success, a class of success. So I'll just put that .success on there, which will add a class of success for me by way of Haml. And so now when my visit count gets over a certain amount, I'll have a customized message displayed. And so I can just sort of reload this page a few more times. Growing, growing, growing. And then one more than 60. And I have my little congratulation message. So now we have the ability to have sort of conditionals that are based off of this visit count variable, which is in turn triggered by a before action, which is created by way of our sessions hash. And so if you think about what you need to do on the project by way of having a checkout with a associated shopping cart, this is the kind of thing you're going to need to do. When a user picks a particular product to purchase or to add to their shopping cart, you're going to have to save that information to session. So if we go to sort of my example site that's up on Heroku and give it a few moments to load, we'll see initially that there's no shopping cart, and then when I start clicking on individual products, those are being added to session in the back end. And so I'll add this product to session. It shows up here in my shopping cart. If I add the product more than once, it's not like that product gets added multiple times to session, but sort of a multiplier gets changed. So when you're saving a shopping cart, it's not just which product the user wanted to add to the shopping cart, it's also the quantity of the product that the user wishes to add. And then I can add, say, a few of these. And if I sort of navigate around the website, the cart's always there, because in my code you would see something similar to this, where I have a before filter causing my session to sort of be instantiated and put into an @cart variable that I can then make use of inside of, I think what I'm doing is inside of my application layout. I just have a section so that if there is an @cart variable, display it, and I'll probably have an @cart partial to do that. At any time then the user can click checkout, at which point they could start the checkout process, or they could just clear out their cart, and what will happen on the back end is you're basically clearing out the session. To clear out the session, you can either set a particular session position to nil. So we could go to session count, position visit count, and set it explicitly to nil. Or if you wanted to blow away everything that's in session, there is a method for doing that. which is reset session. So here they have an example of if you want to just set one value within your session to nil, that'll clear out a particular value. If you want to clear out all the data that's in your session, well, reset session will do that for you. And if you think back to when we were doing our messages, so like when we have in our fake Twitter, this idea of posting a new message and getting, oh, what have I done there? I've effectively broken my code now, and I can tell you why. Because I have that exception on except for create, now when the create action fails and it tries to render the index view, it will not have access to a visit count. So the easiest way to fix that is to say, okay, yes, we also want to log creates as part of visit counts, and now it won't be a problem. So I can cause this to fail. So now it says, sorry, your tweets must be within a certain size. Remember that this message here is being set by way of the flash hash. And you can sort of think of the flash hash as being like a single-use session, right? You get to stash something away in the flash hash like we're doing here. And you can redirect, causing a full, like almost as if the user went and clicked on a new link. And ordinarily, if we hadn't stashed this message away inside of the flash, ordinarily all of our state of our application would disappear. With the flash hash, it's like a single-use session. We get to put something in the flash hash at a particular position and have it exist for one redirect and one redirect only. After that redirect occurs, it gets cleared away, as opposed to session, which is, it persists until you manually either clear out the session or set that position to nil. So flash is like a mini session in a sense. And I think that's all I wanted to talk about in terms of using session. The other thing to know is that here I'm just saving an integer into session, but an integer is an object. You can save any type of object you wish into session. So if you were creating a shopping cart, you might be saving an array of product objects to your session. Now, the one downside to that, to persisting entire objects or an array of entire objects into session, is the session size limitation I spoke about earlier, that you only have 4K to work with in your session cookie stores. And so it might be better off, you might be better off, instead of saving the entire product object into your cart, you might just save product IDs, an array of product IDs, and maybe a parallel array of quantities, or an array of hashes where you have both the ID and the quantity inside of each hash, and that way you wouldn't be likely to fill up your entire cookie store. You do have the option always, if you want to have a larger cookie store, you can switch to the active record cookie store, where the data is saved on the server side, and then the cookie just identifies the user and links it to the data that's saved server side. But for simplicity reasons, it's nice just to use the basic cookie store for session, and then just try to keep your cookie size small by not persisting so many large objects into the session itself. So that's something to think about when you're doing your shopping cart. And on that note, I think I will stop the screencast.